You're listening to Neurobites, a podcast dedicated to making neuroscience, psychology, and mental health research more accessible to the general public. I'm Lila Urogdy, your Neurobites host, and I study neuroscience at the University of Michigan. Welcome back to Neurobites. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history and evolution of depression and its treatment, and kind of how we've come to understand depression as a medical condition, a psychiatric condition, a psychological condition, etc. Basically, how society views depression, how scientists view depression, how we treat depression, and how this has all evolved over the past few thousand years. Symptoms of depression have been recorded in the human population for thousands of years, but our understanding of the disorder has shifted and changed throughout time. And as a result, the way that society views depression and the way that depression is treated has changed alongside these beliefs. And the way that we view depression largely shapes the way that it's treated, which makes sense. And so because of that, it's crucial that we have an accurate understanding of what depression truly is. And that is the purpose of this episode. The earliest recordings of mental illness were recorded a few thousand years before the Common Era, so that's BCE. For example, in some ancient societies like Mesopotamia and Egypt, mental illness was thought to be caused by supernatural causes like demon possession. So because of this, people who had mental illness or who presented symptoms of what we would today consider mental illness were feared by society. And society thought that these people were dangerous, and that makes sense that they thought that they would be dangerous and that they feared these people if they believed that mental illness and these symptoms were actually caused by demon possession. So as a result, people who showed signs of what we would now classify as mental illness would experience beatings, starvation, and exorcism in the attempt to drive out those evil spirits. Around 460 to 370 BCE, humans' view of mental illness and illnesses in general fundamentally changed when Hippocrates, a Greek physician, proposed the four humors theory, a theory that suggested that illnesses stemmed from physical causes. So because of this change in the view of what we would today call mental illness as a demon possession problem caused by supernatural causes, a shift now to believing that these are caused more by physical causes. This is the reason why Hippocrates is called father of medicine. Now, like I said, he came up with the four humors theory for all diseases. It wasn't just mental illness. But that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. His theory is scientifically flawed, but his ideas were a very important turning point in medicine, and especially mental illness. So his theory was the four humors theory. And he believed that illnesses stem from changes in four bodily fluids. And these changes resulted from environmental factors and lifestyle. But I just found the etymology of the word humor fascinating, so I thought I'd share it with you. So the Greeks use the word chemos, meaning juice or sap, while the English word humor ultimately comes from Latin, which has a similar meaning of fluid or moisture. So it's a little bit gross to think about, but humor essentially means bodily juices. What are the four humors? They are blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Hippocrates believed that an excess of black bile in the body caused melancholia, which is what we would today call depression. In Greek, the word melancholia literally means black bile, and it stems from melas, meaning black, and choli, meaning bile. So we have melas and choli, and combining that, we have the word melancholia, which is what they called symptoms that we would today probably consider mental illness or depression. And these roots also appear in words like melanin, cholera, cholesterol, and acetylcholine. So if you're interested in some of the etymology of biological terms, there you go. There's a little bit of background. So what were the treatments for melancholia in Hippocrates' time? Well, treatments were targeted towards balancing the four humors, and they included things like exercise, special diets, warm baths, and bloodletting, which is very common for multiple diseases, and this involved withdrawing blood out of the body in order to balance the humors. In the 2nd century CE, Galen, a philosopher, surgeon, and physician in the Roman Empire, expanded upon Hippocrates' ideas. He agreed with Hippocrates and suggested that each of the 4 humors were linked to an individual's health and temperament. And Galen believed that people with melancholia, caused by an excess of black bile, had a melancholic temperament, which was characterized by physical and psychological symptoms that we would today probably classify as something like depression. Fast forward a little bit to the Middle Ages, between around roughly the 5th to 15th centuries CE, mental illness was again viewed through a religious lens. The term acedia was used to describe a state of listlessness, lack of motivation, and despair. People believed that acedia was caused by spiritual weakness, moral failure, or lack of faith, and because of this, acedia was considered sinful. And so as a result, some of the treatments for acedia focused on things like prayer and religious interventions. A little bit later, during the Renaissance, melancholia was again viewed in a different light. Some people believed that depressive symptoms were correlated with things like talent, creativity, and intelligence. And so as a result, it was sometimes romanticized in art and literature, and it was more socially accepted in some contexts. However, there was still an overall general lack of understanding of what depression really was. And again, it wasn't called depression at that time. In the 17 and 1800s, this marked the rise of the asylums and the early foundation of psychiatry. So during this time, there was a rise in psychiatric institutions for people with mental illnesses, as they were seen to be more of a result of physical origins as opposed to moral failures and demon possessions like in the past. As a result, people with mental illness were institutionalized. Now, I want to be clear here. I don't want to make it sound like I'm romanticizing these institutions and saying that they were humane and good. I just want to point out that these asylums were not humane. They involved torture and restraint. They were by no means a good treatment for people with depression, and they often did much more harm than good. However, I do believe that this was an important step in the history of mental health treatment because this period laid the foundation for the emergence of the field of psychiatry, especially during the period of reform movements later on. So again, these institutions were not necessarily humane, but it does mark a shift from believing that mental illness is demon possession and then realizing that there might be more of a medical cause. Now, again, the actual root cause was not actually treated, but this was an important shift. There was a reform movement in terms of psychiatric institutions. We have activists like French physician Philippe Pinel and American social reformer Dorothea Dix. During this reform movement, Pinel and Dix advocated for things like humane treatment of those with mental illness, and they insisted that patients were treated with more dignity. And then Dorothea Dix, in particular, helped establish numerous hospitals that were more humane. So this was an important step forward in terms of the field of psychiatry and the treatment of mental illnesses. When patients were sent to asylums, they were often sent to asylums against their will, and they still lacked the autonomy and the community that is so essential for mental health. And so they didn't really have the chance to lead a healthy life in society. And this is why the period of deinstitutionalization that came a little bit later was so important. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the classification of mental disorders. So around this time, mental disorders, which were all once just kind of lumped together, began to become separated into distinct disorders. For example, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Emil Kraepelin, a German psychiatrist, classified 2 types of mental illness. So this didn't encompass all types of mental illness, but he did classify 2 types. The first is manic depression, and this involved conditions similar to what we today consider mood disorders like bipolar disorder and unipolar depression. That was the first class. And then the other class was dementia praecox. And this is similar to the psychotic symptoms that are related to what we would today call schizophrenia and related disorders. And Kraepelin believed that mental illness stems from genetic and biological causes, but he lacked the evidence to back up these theories. As our understanding of mental illness grew, the classification system for mental illness became more complex, as indicated by the publication of the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, in 1952. And I'll discuss this more in a few minutes. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Sigmund Freud was a prominent figure in the field of psychology. He developed the psychodynamic theory and described three parts of the mind, which were the ego, the superego, and the id. And Freud used the term melancholia to describe what we would today call depression, and he believed that it was tied to the loss of an object or person, for example, the loss of a parent. And this led to internal conflict and anger turned inward. As a treatment, Freud developed a type of therapy called psychoanalysis, which was aimed at becoming aware of subconsciously repressed emotions, desires, and fears in order to influence conscious thoughts and behaviors. His theories are very controversial, I will say that. His treatment methods were very controversial, but this does lay an important foundation for later psychotherapies like cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. Additionally, in the early 1930s, an early treatment was developed called electroconvulsive therapy, which I will from now on call ECT. Formal treatment was developed in 1938 by Italian neurologist Ugo Carletti, and ECT essentially uses electricity in the brain to induce a seizure. When they were first used, patients were not put under anesthesia or given anything to relax their muscles, and as you can imagine, this could be kind of traumatic and could lead to bones breaking from muscle convulsions without muscle relaxants. Today, ECT is still used for severe treatment-resistant depression and those who experience suicidal ideations, but typically only after most other treatments are exhausted. So patients are now fortunately put under anesthesia and given muscle relaxants to avoid any broken bones that could occur. The procedure involves sending small electrical currents through the brain to induce a seizure, which lasts about 30 to 60 seconds. And during this time, brain activity is monitored using an electroencephalogram or EEG. Typically, it's not just done once. There's usually about 10 sessions over a few weeks. And initial benefits often occur after around 5 to 6 sessions, so it's not instantaneous that effects are seen. It usually takes multiple treatments for the benefits to be seen. There are side effects to ECT, and that's why it's not used as a first-line treatment. It can lead to memory loss, which can be mild or severe, headaches, soreness, and confusion. And the mechanism is also not fully understood, so scientists don't really understand exactly why inducing the seizure can help alleviate depression. It might involve things like neuroplasticity and changes in brain chemistry, which could aid in recovering from depression. And again, it's not a first-line treatment due to the side effects, and also there's a variability in who responds, so not everyone responds positively to ECT. Another treatment that emerged in the 1930s was the lobotomy. It was originally invented by Antonio Igas Moniz, and it was made popular a decade later by Walter Freeman, known infamously as the ice pick surgeon. The term lobotomy comes from the Greek prefix lobo, which means lobe, and the Greek suffix otomy, which means to make an incision or to cut into. The lobotomy essentially severs connections between the frontal lobe and the thalamus, and it was used to treat mental illness. The way that Walter Freeman conducted this procedure was what was called the transorbital lobotomy. So it involved driving a sharp object through the eye socket and then passing through a thin layer of bone and then into the brain. And then from here, connections were severed by moving this sharp tool back and forth, and it was then done in the other eye. During this time, patients were not properly anesthetized. Sedatives were typically used, or a brief ECT session sometimes to make them temporarily unconscious beforehand, but typical anesthetics that we would use today were not used at that time for these procedures. People who received lobotomies often died, and those who didn't die, there were many that survived and were permanently disabled. As you can imagine, the procedure lacked strong evidence that it was beneficial and effective, likely because it was not super accurate. It's kind of done blindly, especially if you're going through that eye and just moving the pick back and forth. You can't exactly see what's going on. So that's why it lacked strong evidence for actually being effective. In the 1950s, chemists were developing drugs to treat tuberculosis. One such drug was iproniazid. Unexpectedly, when patients were given this medication, they experienced improved mood and appetite. And as a result, doctors had accidentally stumbled upon the first antidepressant. This led to the development of the first class of antidepressants called MAOIs, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Now, MAOs are enzymes that typically break down serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. These neurotransmitters are called monoamines. Thus, MAO inhibitors block these MAO enzymes, so they can't break down these neurotransmitters, allowing for monoamines to become more available in the brain, which seems to improve mood. MAOIs are not used as a first-line treatment for depression today because MAO enzymes also break down an amino acid called tyramine, which helps regulate blood pressure. So if tyramine can't be broken down when the MAOs are blocked, this can lead to dangerously high blood pressure, which is why people who take MAOIs must stick to a strict diet and be careful with other dangerous drug interactions. Shortly after the discovery of iproniazid, another class of antidepressants was created called tricyclics, named after their chemical structure, and these work by increasing norepinephrine and serotonin in the brain. However, they also affect other receptors in the brain, leading to adverse side effects, which is why they aren't used as a first-line treatment for depression nowadays either. What's really important to note here is that the discovery of the first antidepressants contributed to the period of deinstitutionalization. More people were able to be treated in communities and at home with medication rather than in institutions, leading to a lot of people being able to be released into society and live a functional life on these medications as opposed to being involuntarily admitted to an institution where they couldn't live a full life. So that's one of the really big things that came out of the discovery of antidepressants was this period of deinstitutionalization. These drugs also led to the monoamine hypothesis, which suggested that depression was linked to chemical imbalances in the brain of monoamine neurotransmitters. First is serotonin, which is involved in mood regulation, sleep, appetite, and digestion, among other things. Fun fact, most of the serotonin in your body is actually produced in the gut, not the brain. But anyway, serotonin is one of the monoamine neurotransmitters, and then norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, which is involved in alertness and attention, as well as dopamine, which is involved in things like motivation and motor movements, among other things. In the 1980s, the second generation of antidepressants was invented, and it was an SSRI, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the way that this medication works, it essentially blocks the reuptake of serotonin, and it just makes it more available in the brain. The first SSRI that was created was called fluoxetine, known under the brand name as Prozac. And then shortly after, other SSRIs followed, including Zoloft and Lexapro, among others. Although SSRIs weren't more effective in terms of treating depressive symptoms compared to MAOIs and tricyclics, they were revolutionary because they generally had fewer negative side effects than older antidepressants. Other medications, such as serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, or SNRIs, like Cymbalta, as well as atypical antidepressants, such as Wellbutrin, were also invented. SNRIs act on serotonin and norepinephrine, as the name suggests, and then Wellbutrin acts on norepinephrine and dopamine. Around the time that the first antidepressants were created, there was also a push to distinguish and classify mental health diagnoses. One of the main motivations for this classification was to diagnose and treat veterans coming back from World War II. In 1948, the 6th edition of the ICD, or International Classification of Diseases, published by the World Health Organization, was the first edition to include mental health diagnoses. A few years later, in 1952, the first edition of the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was published with the goal of standardizing the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders, making it easier to study and develop treatments for them. However, the terminology used and diagnoses for mood disorders used in the first DSM were very different than those that we now use. The third edition of the DSM was the first time that the term major depressive disorder was introduced, and then in the DSM-5, published in 2013, the diagnosis persistent depressive disorder was introduced, which is characterized by depressive symptoms that often last longer, often multiple years, and it's typically more mild but more persistent than an episode of major depressive disorder, although the two can and often do co-occur. The edition of the DSM that is currently used in the field of psychiatry is the DSM-5 Text Revision, or DSM-5-TR, and this was released in 2022, but it's not much different than the original DSM-5, which, like I said before, was published in 2013. So I think that it's way past time that we make an update to the DSM or create a better way to classify and diagnose mental health diagnoses. Let's turn back to the evolution of psychotherapy, which is still commonly used today as a treatment for depression. Like I said before, Freud's psychoanalysis laid an early foundation, but more modern psychotherapies have been developed based on our more complex understanding of depression. For example, in the 1960s, Aaron Beck, an American psychiatrist, developed the theory that depression stems from the cognitive triad, which is one's belief about themselves, the world, and their future. Beck linked depression to cognitive distortions and negative thoughts related to these three things, and he developed cognitive behavioral therapy as a treatment. The purpose of CBT is for a therapist to guide a patient to reframe their negative cognitions by using rational evidence, allowing them to engage in more adaptive behaviors. A few decades later, psychologist Marsha Linehan developed dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, which focuses on emotional regulation, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, which involves learning communication skills, as well as acceptance and mindfulness. DBT is often used primarily for things like personality disorders, but it is also effective for the treatment of other conditions like depression and suicidal ideation, among others. Now that I've discussed the history of how depression has been viewed and treated in the past and provided some background about how therapies and medications for depression have evolved in the past century, we've arrived at modern day. You might be wondering how all of this history has led us to how we currently view and treat depression. As I'm sure I've repeated multiple times throughout different episodes, there's a lot that is known, but there's much more that is not known. The field is in a constant state of evolution as more research is being done, but today I'll discuss where we stand now. As I mentioned before, the first antidepressants were created by accident when their effects were discovered on patients being treated for tuberculosis. Thus, there still isn't a solid understanding of exactly what causes depression. Researchers didn't discover what they believed caused depression and develop a drug that specifically targeted for these mechanisms. Instead, they inadvertently found a drug that worked and worked their way backwards to hypothesize these mechanisms, which is where the monoamine hypothesis was born. Although specific neurotransmitters are hypothesized to play a role in the development of depression, I do want to emphasize that depression is not simply a chemical imbalance, as was once believed, and it's a common misconception even now. One interesting fact that I can tell you is that SSRIs, the first-line medication used for major depressive disorder today, is more effective than placebo, but only marginally so. To explain this, I want you to understand the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. So statistical significance, in a broad sense, means that there is a low probability that the difference between two groups being compared is due to chance alone, and thus there is likely an actual difference between groups. For example, if one group of depressed patients received a placebo pill, and another group receives an SSRI. Let's say that in the group that receives the SSRI, more patients recover from their depression than in the group with the placebo pill. Is this due to random chance, or is the SSRI actually more effective for treating depression? If the probability that the difference would occur by chance is low, the results are considered statistically significant, meaning there's likely a difference between the SSRI and placebo for depression. Most studies comparing placebo to SSRIs yield statistically significant results. So on the surface, yes, technically SSRIs are effective compared to not taking an SSRI. However, statistical significance itself doesn't say anything about how different the groups actually are. For example, it's possible that the group taking the SSRI had 51% of the patients recover, while the group not taking the SSRI had 50% of patients recover. How meaningful or large a difference that actually exists is called the effect size, and that's important to look at too. For example, one review paper found that in contrast to what was once believed, antidepressants were effective in reducing symptoms in only about 40% of patients. Now, this is more than placebo, but in placebo, about 30% of patients experienced a reduction in depressive symptoms, and the effect size was 0.3. Just to give you some reference, in general, an effect of 0.5 is considered moderate, an effect of 0.8 is considered large. Thus, an effect of 0.3 is considered moderately low. If antidepressants worked in only 40% of patients, and even a placebo pill works in 30%, is a neurotransmitter imbalance truly the cause of depression? What are other plausible explanations for the cause of depression, and what other treatments might be more effective? The key is to stay curious and just keep asking questions, because The more you ask questions, the more you get answers, and this leads us closer and closer to the truth. So I want you to consider this. The dopamine dysregulation hypothesis of ADHD has more evidence behind it than the serotonin and the monoamine hypothesis behind depression. Stimulant medications which act on the dopamine system are efficacious in about 70 to 80% of patients with ADHD and consistently perform much better than placebo. So if we're comparing a treatment for depression, which only works about 40% of the time compared to 30% of patients receiving the placebo that experience a reduction in symptoms. And then we compare that to ADHD, which has a 70 to 80% effectiveness in treatments for ADHD. I think that there's a better explanation for what's causing depression, and I'm a little bit skeptical about the serotonin hypothesis for depression. Now, I'm not going to completely disregard it. I do think that serotonin likely plays a role in depression and the other monoamines, but I encourage you to do your own research and form kind of your own opinion. My goal is to provide you with enough information in this episode to get you curious enough to explore the literature on your own and start formulating new hypotheses about this. Because I think that if we have more people that are thinking about this critically, then we can come closer and closer to an understanding of what depression actually is. If a serotonin imbalance isn't the main cause of depression, what is? The current literature suggests that depression is a result of brain biology, including structure and function, and yes, possibly a neurotransmitter dysregulation. Genetics, depression is moderately tied to genetics. It's not as high as something like ADHD or bipolar disorder in terms of heritability, but genetics does play a moderate role in the development of depression. But environment and experience also contribute a fairly large amount to the development of depression. It's also known that chronic stress can be harmful, and there's a lot of evidence linking chronic stress to depression due to its effects on the brain and body. And individuals who experience MDD or major depressive disorder are more prone to experiencing it again and again with shorter times in between each episode, possibly due to biological changes resulting from or causing depression that make individuals have a heightened response to stress in the future. So this is the stress sensitization hypothesis. And then environmental factors and experiences such as poverty, bullying, history of trauma, being around others who are depressed, and then things like racism, sexism, and all the other isms that exist. So if you think about it, if someone's experiencing deep depression because they have been traumatized or because they have been consistently discriminated against, then giving someone a medication that is going to increase the availability of serotonin is not going to get rid of these environmental factors and these stress factors that are actually causing the depression. So I just want you to think about that and keep that in mind as well. Some of the modern cognitive or psychological theories include Aaron Beck's theory that depression stems from negative cognitive distortions, especially in relation to the cognitive triad, which I mentioned earlier. So this is essentially the idea that people with depression have automatic negative thoughts, and by replacing these negative thoughts with positive ones, this can help to change these negative cognitive distortions and negative maladaptive behaviors. And then another kind of cognitive or psychological theory is the idea of hopelessness. The idea is that a person with depression experiences three things. One is that it's internal, so they believe that their problems are their fault. It's caused by me, it's my problem, it's internal, it's not external. The second idea is that these issues are stable, so what's happening to me is always going to happen to me. It's stable across time. It's never going to get better. Things are always going to be this bad. And then the third thing is global. So everything is bad. It's not just this one thing, but it's everything. And so when something positive happens, it's kind of the opposite. Instead of being internal, it's external. So if I did something good or if something went well, it wasn't because of me. It was just by chance. It was just lucky. It was just something external. Additionally, it's the opposite of stability. So if something good happened, then it's not going to last. It's just for now. It's not going to be like this forever, or it's not going to be good in the future. And then the opposite of global. So it's just this one thing that's good. Not everything is good. Just this one thing. Everything else is bad. So that's kind of the idea of hopelessness. Again, their issues are internal, stable, and global, and things that are positive are external, transient, and focused on this one thing and not global. Right now, depression is defined in the DSM-5. We have major depressive disorder, which requires 5 or more symptoms from a list at least one of which must be depressed mood and or loss of interest or pleasure in activities, and these symptoms must be present most of the day, every day, for a period of at least 2 weeks. So this is a relatively short period of time. People can have short episodes of major depressive disorder. It often lasts longer than 2 weeks, but at least 2 weeks is required. And like I said, as time goes on, people who experience these episodes often experience more and more episodes that are closer together and that last longer. Overall, patients who have MDD often have episodes that last a few weeks or months, followed by a period of remission and then relapse, like I mentioned before. Children and adolescents were once thought to not be able to have depression, but now it's commonly understood that children and adolescents very much, in fact, do get depression and are able to have depression. But they often have different symptoms, so they can be very irritable when depressed and hyperactive, which is a little bit different than what you might think when you think of depression. Another diagnosis is what's called persistent depressive disorder, where symptoms are present for 2 years, at least 1 year in children and adolescents, but 2 years for adults, and they're present most of the time with gaps of symptoms lasting no more than 2 months at a time. I'm not going to be discussing bipolar depression or any other types of depression. There are other types of depression, but right now I'm just focusing mainly on unipolar depression. Current treatment approaches for depression include typically a combination of psychotherapy and medication because it's understood that depression stems from psychological and environmental causes as well as biological causes. So psychotherapy and medication is considered the gold standard right now. It's important to address both the underlying psychological cause as well as how it physically manifests in the brain and body. For example, if it stems from trauma, then addressing this trauma can be a helpful step in treating depression. I also just want to emphasize that societal factors like chronic discrimination and poverty are also leading causes of depression, and if these aren't directly addressed, then no amount of therapy is going to erase things like racism or xenophobia or sexism or homophobia, etc. The current most common combination used for depression is CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy and SSRIs. And then, like I mentioned before, in severe cases, ECT may be used. Other factors that are often managed are things like diet, sleep, and exercise, which aren't cures, but they can definitely help alleviate some of the symptoms of depression, and they might be contributing factors in exacerbating depressive symptoms. The issue with trying to alter diet and sleep and exercise to treat depression is that there's kind of a paradox because having depression often makes it difficult to do these things, makes it more difficult to get up and exercise or to eat a healthy meal or to fall asleep easily. So that is where we're at right now. Where are we headed in the future? Let's be honest, we don't have treatments that are as effective as they could be. So what are some emerging treatments in the field? One emerging treatment is transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which uses magnetic fields to stimulate neurons in specific regions of the brain. Like ECT, the exact mechanisms aren't fully understood, but TMS seems to be successful in about 30 to 64% of cases, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Obviously, this range is quite large, and the effectiveness varies depending on the person, but it does seem to be effective in some cases. The difference between TMS and ECT is that TMS is more localized, usually targeted to a specific brain region. Patients are also awake when they are receiving TMS. They're not anesthetized, and TMS doesn't typically cause seizures. Seizures would be a rare side effect that it's not supposed to occur, but they sometimes very rarely do happen. And TMS also has a much lower risk of cognitive or memory issues, and it's overall safer. However, ECT does seem to be a little bit more effective in treating patients with severe depression, especially those who are contemplating suicide. Another treatment that's becoming more popular is ketamine. To be honest, I haven't done a ton of research on ketamine and how it works and why it works, but if you're interested, let me know and I can do some research and create an episode about it. The use of psychedelics in controlled therapeutic settings are also being explored for severe depression as well as other conditions like PTSD. But all in all, scientists and physicians have come a long way in their understanding of mental health and its treatment. When I'm challenging the monoamine hypothesis and challenging some of these things that I've discussed in the episode and saying, oh, maybe SSRIs aren't that effective, I'm not in any way trying to discount where we're at right now or how far that we have come. I just want to point out that there's still a long way to go. And so we have come a long way and we do know a lot more than we used to. And we're making important strides in this field, but there is still a long way to go. And that's really what I want to emphasize in this episode and in my podcast in general. I encourage you to not take what I'm telling you at face value and just believe everything I say. I encourage you to take all the information I've given you and do your own research and make your own observations and create your own hypotheses. I always encourage this because in science, it's really important not to blindly believe everything that someone tells you, but to approach things openly with an open mind, consider all the facts, and then explore any skepticisms or curiosities that you may have. With that being said, that is where I'll end today. In this episode, I offered some of the general history of how depression and mental illness has been viewed and treated throughout the years, but there is so much history and science I didn't get to today. So I just want to let you know that I simplified lots of things, but I'm very happy to dive deeper into any topic that you're interested in. With that being said, thank you so much for listening to the Neurobites podcast and expanding your knowledge of psychology and neuroscience. If you think a friend would be interested in this podcast, I'd appreciate it if you could share it with a friend so we can grow this community together. If you're interested in learning more about this topic or have any other questions, reach out to me at neuro_bites_podcast on Instagram or email me at neurobitespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to the next episode.